Again, in 1 Peter 2, for this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it you endure, but when you do good and suffer for it you endure? This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in His steps. Notice that first of all, that this example is for those for whom Christ suffered, for who Christ has called, that He has left them this example that they might follow Him in His steps. This is a pattern of life and ethical behavior that was not given in the Old Covenant. The example of Christ Himself, nor could it have been given in the Old Covenant, because you cannot say, look to the cross and the crucified Messiah and be like Him, until after that happens. You can't tell someone to look to something that hasn't happened yet and to follow an example of something that hasn't happened yet. This law of the new covenant pertains only to the new covenant, and as we can clearly see, only to the members of this new covenant. Christ is our example. Let's look again at a few other texts. In 1 John, John says, by this we know that we are in Him, for whoever says he abide in Him ought to walk in the same way in which He walked. You notice that the ethical call here is to comport ourselves in the same way that Christ comported Himself. Look to Christ as your example. Look again in 1 Corinthians 11. Paul says, be imitators of me as I am an imitator of Christ. Paul himself says that his ethical standard is to imitate Christ's sacrificial, humble, loving way of living. Let us look in Ephesians 5. Paul there says, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave Himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. And so look what he's saying here. Walk in love just as Christ loved us. There it is again. Love the way that Christ loved. Let's look in 1 John 3:16. John says, by this we know love, that He laid His life down for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. We ought to imitate Christ sacrificially, lovingly, humbly. We are to be imitators of Christ. And again in 1 Peter 4:1, Peter says, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. And so there it is again. Think the same way that Christ thinks. None of these things could possibly have been ethical standards or requirements of people who were living under the Mosaic regime. This can only be true of those who are in the new covenant. This can only be true of those who are living after the cross, that they have the pattern to look back to pattern their lives after. You cannot pattern your life after something that has not happened. And as we've already shown, that this pattern is laid out for those who are in the new covenant. And we'll see more of that later. And lastly, we see here again in John 15, Jesus repeats it again. This is my commandment, not Moses's, my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. The example of Christ is everywhere. Hebrews 12:1-4, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with the endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, The founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him. Consider him. Consider him. Pattern yourself after him. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted as you endure from sinners such hostility. Do you see that Christ is our pattern?